Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302. And today we're going to be capping off our discussion that we've talked about throughout the past several weeks of the Gilded Age and how it impacted the nation. And today we're going to focus on a much smaller topic, that of the election of 1896, and how it's going to bring the American Gilded Age to an end and how it's ultimately going to herald in a new era. Now, before we can start talking about the election of 1896, we need to once again focus on what was occurring in the Gilded Age by the end of the century. Now, within the United States, by the end of the century, we saw that the nation had been greatly impacted by industrialization, and this has spread to all regions of the nation. Now, with this industrialization, we did see that a great amount of wealth was also coming over to the United States, and something that I didn't mention in a previous lecture that you probably read about in your book was that America by this point was becoming the leading industrial power of the world. However, with all this wealth beginning to come to the United States, it was not evenly distributed. We see that the rich, those robber barons, those captains of industry, they were becoming richer, but the average American was becoming poorer. We see a growth in what's called the wealth gap. Now, with this in mind, this is where we see that many Americans also saw this as natural progress, where they justified it through such ideas as social Darwinism. But for the majority of Americans, that idea of social Darwinism, that was not a good idea to them. They believed that there needed to be major reforms to American society because if it continued to go on this path, well, ultimately, Americans felt they were losing their freedom. Essentially, what they wanted was Hamiltonian means of government, of a stronger, more active federal government to achieve Jeffersonian freedom, to have and guarantee those individual rights, to truly be seen as equals. And so this is where, building up to the election of 1896 and in the 1890s, Americans were calling for reform. And there will be several political organizations that would look to address this reform. And to some extent, we'll see members of the Republican and the Democratic Party will try to push forth for reform, but more notably, we'll see that third parties, as well as other organizations, are going to be the one that are going to try to herald that reform, to change American society, to live up to those expectations that all men were created equal, to begin to decrease that wealth gap. And one of the biggest organizations that would become reform-minded and that would look to create a more equal American society in the midst of the Gilded Age would be that of the Populists. Now, to understand the Populists and why they will become so popular and why they might ultimately could challenge one of the two major political parties, we need to understand who the Populists were and what were their origins. Now, the Populists, they're mainly going to be discontent farmers. Now, we talked about how industrialization impacted the settlement of the West as well as the western frontier. And we saw that with the settlement of the West, most Americans, most homesteaders that were going out west were wanting their own farms. Now, when they established their own farms, they did have a market that they could contribute to. That of the growing markets for produce, especially back over in American cities that were beginning to expand and expand and expand, that highly demanded these products. And these farmers would respond to it. However, they would not acquire a great amount of wealth. There will be a couple of things that would plague their community, but the biggest one would be poverty. And why is this the case? Well, it's because many of these farmers are going to overproduce their crops. This is going to drive down prices, and when prices plummet, they're not going to make as high of incomes. As a result, they won't be able to pay things like their mortgage, they won't be able to pay back rent on tools as well as other things, and this is going to create a lot of discontent from these farmers who are going to demand that there's some sort of, whether it's state or federal legislation that gets it, that helps improve their conditions. And we'll see from here, they begin to form things like the Granger movement and later on Farmers Alliances, which would call for political action for reform. And eventually, by the end of the 1880s, coming out of Kansas, we'll see the formation of the Populist Party, which was a reform-minded party to bring relief not only to these farmers, but in time would look to also ally with American workers working for various industries. Now, the Populists, they are going to be a reform-minded organization. Basically what they're calling for is, once again, a more active federal government to where they begin to reform much of American society so that way progress wasn't going completely awry and we don't see the continuation of this growth within the wealth gap. We'll see that they would adopt many reforms. We'll talk about the coinage of silver here in a second to cause inflation. We'll also see that they would call for allowing farmers to store their crops within storehouses that were funded by the federal government. They would call for a reduction in railway rates, making sure that there were fair practices on the railways, as well as in some cases calling for rights for American women, for the right to vote particularly. And we'll see that this would become very popular out on the frontier, especially as it appeals to farmers as well as women. And the populist movement will begin to grow. And in 1890, we'd see that the populists would take several seats, not only in, say, Kansas, but we'd see that there would be a governor elected in Kansas who was a member of the Populist Party. We'll also see that several seats in Congress would be filled with populists. And their group was only expanding as we entered the 1890s, and they were becoming a formidable political force. And we'll see that they would begin to adopt other reforms that they hoped would appeal to American workers to only continue to expand their organization. And by the elections of 1892, and then eventually when we get to the election of 1896, in these presidential election years, they would be a significant force. Now, the big issue, though, that they're going to campaign off of in 1892 and in 1896 is going to center around what's known as the money question. So the biggest item that the populists are going to campaign off of by the 1890s is going to center around this money question. And it goes back to the conditions that we see with these discontent farmers and ultimately why they would support this stance. Now, during the 1860s, 70s, 80s, all the way up to the end of the 1800s, we see that the U.S. dollar was beginning to depreciate. We see that there was this phenomenon known as deflation that was beginning to occur that was leading to lower prices and so on and so forth. And many farmers are going to contribute that because we see the depreciation of the American dollar, it is because, or it leads directly to why they were in this poverty-stricken state. And they believe that the best way to solve this issue, to solve the money question, was to begin to coin silver. Now, to understand why they're calling for this, well, first we need to understand the U.S. dollar back in the 1800s, it was backed by gold. Well, by this point, there was a shortage of gold around the world, and i.e., with the shortage of gold, this is where prices begin to drop. Now, with that in mind, the populists, to try to raise prices, are going to call for the coinage of silver. So that way the U.S. dollar was not only backed by gold, but also silver. This would cause inflation, lead to rising prices, and as they hoped, would eventually improve their livelihoods by increasing their incomes. And it's to no surprise that this organization that would be founded by mainly discontent farmers would begin to take up this fight for the unlimited coinage of silver to cause inflation. Now that has its own problems, and you can talk about it with an economics class, but nonetheless that's what these farmers were, as well as the populists, were hoping to achieve. And as we enter the 1890s, when we look at presidential elections, especially the election of 1896, this will be the big question at the center of the election. Whether or not the U.S. should coin silver or if it should only have its dollar backed by gold. But anyways, now that we know the platform of the populists and we start to see them rise as a major political force, let's now turn to the election of 1896, which would be such a crucial election, not only in terms of this money question, but ultimately for the future of the nation, and with the end of that election, eventually herald in a new era. Now, the origins to the election of 1896 are going to stem around this money question. And particularly, we can date it to other issues that were also beginning to prevail by the time we get to 1896. Now, by the 1890s, the money question was a very popular issue amongst farmers, the populace, as well as reform-minded individuals. But alongside that, we also see that Americans, as they were approaching another presidential election, another thing that's going to contribute to why they're going to support reform-minded parties is we see the emergence of a financial panic in 1893. This was a part of those bust cycles that were associated with American industrialization, and there were millions of Americans who were unemployed. And it makes organizations like the Populists more popular. Not to mention, it's also going to make the other political party that was not in power, it's going to make them popular. Now, with the Panic of 1893, in office was Grover Cleveland, a Democratic president. Now, with that said, he didn't cause the Depression, but many Americans are going to associate him with the Depression, especially when he puts the U.S. back on the gold standard in the midst of this Depression. Many are going to begin to condemn his actions and either support the Republicans or begin to support this populist party. And by 1894, with the midterm elections, while we do see the rise of this populist party, we'll also see that the Republicans are going to gain substantial ground. And it basically ensured whoever became the Republican nominee in 1896, they were guaranteed to become the next president, unless the Democrats were to adopt a reform platform. Now, the individual who would ultimately become the Republican nominee in 1896 is going to be that of William McKinley. Now, William McKinley, he is going to be a lost figure within this election. He's going to be campaigning on similar issues that the Republicans have been campaigning for the past several decades, promoting things like protectionism, i.e. tariffs to protect American businesses, and so on and so forth. Now, that won't necessarily make him very popular, especially with some of these discontent farmers and many others, but nonetheless, it was a popular issue amongst American industry. But he has been lost in this midst of the election. However, he's going to create something that's going to change presidential politics. Because in order to try to gain the presidency, he's going to conduct what would become known as the first modern presidential campaign. He's going to begin to appeal to voters, not just within the Republican base, but to different kinds of voters. He would invite to his home in Canton, Ohio, groups like African American groups, former Confederate veterans, even bicycle groups, appealing to them, stating that he would answer the issues that were in front of them. Now, why is that so significant? Well, it's because no president had ever done this before. No president, or I should say presidential candidate, had ever appealed to specific groups. And that's a trend that we only see continue up to this present day. In the meantime, we'll also see that he's going to, or him as well as his campaign manager, that of Mark Hanna, are going to dump millions of dollars into the campaign to try to promote imagery, pamphlets, posters that they would put all across the nation to appeal to American voters. And truly, they would construct a very effective campaign because, spoiler alert, they would ultimately win this election. However, the election, it won't be remembered for what McKinley does in the front porch campaign that he conducts, but it would be remembered by who lost this election, that of the Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan. Now, William Jennings Bryan, he was a political unknown in 1896, but he was an active supporter of what were known as the civil rights, those individuals who might ally with the populace in trying to get the unlimited coinage of silver to cause inflation once again. But anyways, he was a political unknown when we get to the Democratic National Convention in 1896. However, he would eventually rise because of a famous speech that he would deliver, that of the Cross of Gold speech, to where he basically is calling for bimetallism, calling for the U.S. to adopt silver as a part of backing their currency to cause inflation, to relieve these populists as well as other individuals. And he was promoting a good amount of reform also on the campaign trail. And he's going to be the individual that will be remembered during this election. However, as I mentioned before, he's not going to be the one who will ultimately win this election. Now, both candidates will go out on the campaign trail, but in the end, we'll see that when the populists ally themselves with Bryan, because he's not only going to become the Democratic candidate, he'll also become the populist candidate, they're not going to generate enough support from those industrial workers they were trying to appeal to. While they were calling for reform, things like inflation weren't very popular in the cities. Because remember, you as an American consumer, if you're working for a wage, whenever you go out on the weekend, you're going to buy groceries. Well, if you cause inflation, those prices go up. That does not improve your livelihood. And in the end, we'll see that many of them are ultimately going to vote for William McKinley because he's not calling for the coinage of silver and eventually for inflation. And for the first time in almost 20 or well over 20 years by this point, we'll see that McKinley, a presidential candidate, will gain a majority of both the popular vote as well as the electoral vote, and he would cruise into the White House. But when McKinley takes office, even though he wasn't promoting reform, he will herald in a new era. And once McKinley takes the White House on March 4th, 1897, he's going to herald in two new eras. First, we'll see that the progressive era, this kind of reaction to the Gilded Age, promoting for a more active federal government, will somewhat begin under McKinley. It will rapidly accelerate under Theodore Roosevelt, but it somewhat begins with McKinley, as he proves to be a more active president than we'd seen with presidents in the past. But more significantly for us, and what we'll talk about next time, he's going to herald in a new era of American imperialism. He will, shortly after taking office, get involved with a conflict that was developing down in Cuba between the local Cuban population and the Spanish government. And from getting involved in the Spanish-American War, he would eventually construct an empire. And we'll talk more about that when we get to class next time. But anyways, that brings us to an end for this lecture. And before I go ahead and end, just like always, make sure you go out and complete all assignments, as well as complete all the readings from this week, as well as watch all videos. But anyways, in the meantime, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see you on the next lecture.